Greetings, fellow tarot travelers, tripping through the tetrahedral triptych of cards I shall lay before you. I'm Tarot Torch. Let's now turn our gaze to the Orient and the Far East, and have a look at China and its relationship with India for a moment. You know, there have been border and water disputes between China and India because ever since China annexed the land known as Tibet and forced the Tibetan people into submission as an ethnic minority group of mainland China underneath the Han Chinese who run the communist government of mainland China, China now borders countries like Nepal, India, and Bhutan, whereas previously they didn't. There were these buffer zone countries like Tibet. And now India has a direct border with China. And this is causing disputes over Jammu and Kashmir, which is in the northwestern part of India, or the southwestern part of China, where China, India, and Pakistan meet, sort of in a no man's land. And so, you know, it's not because of this, but that adds fuel to the fire of the cynicization and persecution of people like the Tibetans. And there are other ethnic minorities suffering the same. The Uyghurs and Falun Gong also have been persecuted by the Chinese communists. Now, in Tibet, there is a massive infrastructure project, and the Chinese have spent $97 billion and want to spend an additional $290 million upgrading monasteries, putting in hotels, and turning Tibet into a tourist mecca and basically a Disneyland event. But they're exploiting a native culture and commercializing it to make money. And this includes, putting in an airport and everything else that goes with it. But international human rights groups and exiles of Tibet claim that repression and genocide have been committed against the Tibetan people. So this isn't a clean game the Chinese are playing. And certainly other nations have done this. America did this with the Native American Indians. It's happened to Africa. It's happened to South America, Central America, Southeast Asia. So this isn't an unheard of or a unique situation. Now the Tibetan people, they have a very interesting religion. It's a type of Buddhism, and they have the Bo religion. Their Vajrayana Buddhism is very interesting. Yet, they have, with their religion and with their own language and with their own alphabet, they now have no land. What is left of Tibet is basically a police state, and it is a colonized nation that's been entirely invaded and dominated by the Han Chinese. And more than 1.2 million Tibetans have been brutally murdered, and 6,000 monasteries, temples, and historic sites and structures have been looted and destroyed beyond repair. So, China is now mining the ecologically sensitive region. They've put 25% of their nuclear missiles in Tibet, turning Tibet into a nuclear waste dump. And there's 400,000 Chinese troops stationed in Tibet and over 8 million Chinese colonists in Tibet. So, we have a real problem here. Now, according to Padmasambhava, sort of the saint of Vajrayana Buddhism for the Tibetan people, he stated that this exodus would happen in his prophecies and that the Chinese people would never return to Tibet. And, maybe that's what we're facing, is that in the future, you can be a Tibetan and not have land. If you speak the language, if you know the alphabet, if you practice the religion, and you're with those people, then you can do this in Italy, basically. And that may happen to Americans and Chinese and Israelis and Palestinians and Russians and everybody else in between. Whereas we grow into a global society, people will no longer be land connected with their ethnic identification. And we may see people supporting multiple ethnic identifications. You might have a Tibetan Muslim who used to live in Leh, who's now living in Rome, who identifies with the Palestinian people, and therefore you have an Italian, Tibetan, Muslim, Palestinian, 4 different nationality groups that individual could be participating in. This may be our future, folks, so something to look forward to. And so in inquiring about the Tibetan dilemma, which has been such a thorn for the Chinese people, and indeed it's been so painful for the rest of us to watch wonderful people like the Dalai Lama and his Tibetan monks suffering in such poverty in Nepal and India in their exodus, we'd all like to know what's going on here. So I have 2 decks. This deck is the deck of the Cultural Revolution, and it represents mainland China's intentions in this reading. It's done from propaganda posters of the Communist Chinese that have been plastered in the plazas throughout China since its Communist Revolution began. And this deck is called the Buddha Tarot by Robert M. Place. I'd show you the box, and I can briefly show it to you, but it's just too big of a box to fit in the screen. And this tarot deck is a Vajrayana deck, which is the majorative religion of the Tibetan people. So this will represent Tibet, and this will represent China. So the first thing we'll do is let's just shuffle some of the cards. And there's the Chinese deck off to the side, but still in our view, not leaving our view. I got to make room. This is a real tight shot I'm working here. Okay, there you go. And here's the Vajrayana deck. And this has all been shuffled before the show began, but you know, never hurts to be safe rather than sorry. And here's the cutting of the deck. And we'll put these both to the side as such. And let's begin the reading. So the first card for the Tibetan people is the 6 of Jewels. And the 6 of Jewels represents the 6 of Coins in the Marseille deck, or the 6 of Pentacles in the Rider-Waite-Smith system. And so it is actually that of economic expansionism for the Tibetan people. This isn't a bad card for the Tibetan people. But remember, this is in the placement of the past. Oops, I shuffled these cards very well. And here's the 5 of Jewels. And in the Rider-Waite-Smith system, that has to do with poverty, but in the Marseille Tarot, that has more to do with economic disruption as we enter into another growth phase. And yes, it can mean poverty at the same time. And the next card is Karma, or Justice. Well, that's very interesting. Let's have a look at these cards before we bring out the Chinese cards so we can see what's really going on with the Tibetan people. And it turns out that in their feudal system in Tibet that they had, which many argue was grossly unfair because it was a classist feudal society. But, you know, that's largely what the mainland Chinese want you to believe. But it was a time of prosperity. They had some of the richest art, the most beautiful temples. They had a gorgeous society. They kept their ecological balance with nature. They had lakes they would never fish because they were sacred lakes that were filled with fish. Their rivers were clean. Their forests were filled with trees, and their pockets filled with gold. Now, granted, the majority of the Tibetan people, you know, they're poor herdsmen. And they herd yak, and they don't lead an opulent life. But a person's wealth isn't necessarily what they're wearing on their back that day. You know, you see a multi-billionaire and they're wearing a shirt and trousers, just like everybody else. The wealth of the Tibetan people was in their monasteries, and in their art, and in their tradition, and in their music, and in their culture. And they were a very wealthy people. And then they went from 6 down to 5. And going down to 5 means that they have been thrown into abject poverty. It's a descending configuration. And those are never good. So that means that even though it's just economically disruptive, the fact remains it's a descent. So they are experiencing the begging and the poverty of the 5 of Pentacles of the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. So, you know, they're a conquered people. And they are being colonized, and they are in subjugation, and they are being oppressed. and they're being cynicized, and they are being impoverished and run out of their own lands. Oh my gosh, the Tibetan people who escape China cross on foot through the snow-capped Himalayas, frequently arriving in Nepal dehydrated, exhausted, underfed, and with frostbite. I mean, it's amazing any of them can survive that walk. It's just astounding. And the whole time, dodging bullets from the Chinese. So it's amazing that any of them made it out of China alive. And so many did. They're very brave and very strong people. And they arrive in Nepal and India with no passport. They cannot buy or own property. They have no citizenship. They can't travel. They're basically prisoners of India and Nepal. And that's basically how it works. And they're not a rich people, but they've managed to create quite a nice culture for themselves in India and Nepal, considering how little they had to work with. But they aren't a rich people. I've been there myself to India and visited their communities in Dharamsala, and they are not a rich people. They're very humble. But there's something wonderful about humility. There's something spiritually purifying about it. But it's a hard life, a very hard life for them. And what is in their future is karma or justice. You know, maybe they won't get their land back, but they might get their justice. And justice is a two-edged sword. It's funny. If you ask for justice, you might be the one who's paying the price, because when justice comes in and the two-sided sword sweeps across your reality vector, it might be you that pays the price and not your enemy. The karma is a very complex. Krishna said karma is unfathomable. It's so deep. We have compounding karmas, interactive karma. There's so much karma and such a need for justice in this region of the world. But to put it mildly, there's a karmic glitch with the Tibetan people. They lived on yak meat for an awfully long time, causing many of the humans to reincarnate as yaks, the yaks to reincarnate as humans, and you end up with a yak blood-soaked, blood-drenched dharma of Vajrayana Buddhism. And they didn't progress as a people into technology and into industrialism. They were about to, but the world had advanced beyond them, and they were an isolated kingdom, and so they were conquered. Now, they want justice for being conquered. They want to be returned to their rightful place in their lands. But the truth is they were abusive to the Yak nation. And it was a patriarchal system, and there was an abusiveness towards women. There was an abusiveness towards the lower castes of their society. So, the justice they want from the Chinese, it's hard to know if the Chinese are doling out the justice for them. And this isn't just a purification rite for the Tibetan people. Now, I know a lot have died, but a lot of yaks have died. And humans, oh sure, humans can be ruled as more important as yaks if you're a speciesist, but life is life. And so, I'm not saying the Chinese government is correct, nor that the Chinese people are correct. But when you're dealing with karma and justice, it's hard to know really with the two-sided sword which side you'll be on when the sword falls. Now let's see what the Chinese government has to say about all this. Well, in terms of the wealth of the Tibetan people, we have the Ten of Swords. And I don't think this picture could be any more clear. The Ten of Swords usually represents exhaustion in the Marseille deck, but I think we have to stick with this deck and its pictographic interpretations as a Rider-Waite-Smith system deck, and see this Ten of Swords as being the exploitation of the Tibetan people's wealth, putting in power dams, fishing their sacred lakes, deforesting their lands, putting in airports in ecologically sensitive regions, turning the place into a nuclear waste dump, exploiting the people, and culturally cynicizing them as they turn them into a Disneyland tourist event. And in terms of the, oops, I'm sorry, wrong deck. Little visitation from the Buddha there. And as far as the poverty is concerned of the Tibetan people, we have the dominating Chinese culture with the Ace of Swords. It's absolute domination. It's torture, executions, and of the cruelest type. The Chinese, when they first took over Tibet, would go into their temples and urinate and defecate in them. They took all of their sacred art out, trashed it, and put in things like electric cables and just stored them there in their temples. I mean, it was just unbelievable. They would have these very sincere and noble Tibetan monks forced to execute other Tibetan monks. The cruelty and the evil is unbelievable. And here we see above their poverty and cultural cynicization, the absolute authority of Chinese rule. And then in terms of justice, we have the magician card, which is Mao Zedong. And he's considered a magician by the Chinese communists because he overthrew the emperor and the feudal society of old China by killing only about 60 to 75 million people. So what we have here is a real problem. As you can see, the wealth of Tibet exploited, the poverty of Tibet militaristically enforced as a commitment by the government to commit this atrocity, and the justice sought by the Tibetan people quashed by heartless communism and their ideology. So I did turn this card. I think it would be helpful for us to use this card in this reading for the future and find out a little bit about it. We have I'm sorry, once again, it's this card we pulled. We'll have to pull that one out too, I guess. We have this card, which is the first sermon of the Buddha. And this is the judgment card. So the Tibetans aren't just asking for justice, they're asking for judgment. They're asking in the court of the heavens that justice occur. And the response, as you already noted, is the world. So what we see here is that the Chinese think that they can conquer, exploit, that they have the answers and they're going to take over the world. But it was based on the Tibetan wealth, the usury of the Tibetan people and culture in economic slavery and deprivation. And even though that the Tibetan people want their justice, they want judgment, and they want the judgment of the world community to come forward. And so these are not as actionable as one might expect. Whereas the Ace of Swords, the Ten of Swords, these are more actionable cards. And so what we see here are two higher arcanas versus two higher arcanas. In some ways, they're almost evenly matched. The world knows that the Tibetans are on the moral higher ground. And if it wasn't for economic interactions with mainland China, I think most people would just simply side with the Tibetans. But because the Chinese have a strong military and strong economic ties with the West, the West is forced to deal with the communist Chinese, but I think they all like the Dalai Lama better. I think that's just a statement of fact. Chinese people are very nice people. I like Chinese people. Their government isn't so nice. That's the problem. Nice people with a bad government. And because they have a bad government, the Chinese people of mainland China are being brought up in education systems to not be nice. And the Taiwanese people, by contrast, are very nice because they're brought up in a more traditional context, being taught morality and being taught etiquette and other things that are necessary for qualitative human interactions. And that is one thing that Buddhism does teach, is a quality of being, something that makes a person a quality person rather than an animalistic exploiter of other people. And so, to be honest with you, it looks fairly hopeless for the Tibetan people. They're waiting for justice and they're waiting for judgment. That doesn't mean that they're waiting to return. And they've gone down economically in the country of Tibet. And they're suffering greatly. China seems to have the upper hand almost 100% of the way. But the Tibetan people are the ones that are spiritually correct. And what we're seeing, and this is very interesting, is that there's a spread of Buddhism to the world. And, you know, in the final analysis, the Tibetan people without a nation may end up inheriting the whole planet. And the reason is that Buddhism is spreading like wildfire to every country on earth. Not just Tibetan Buddhist Vajrayana Buddhism, but all forms of Buddhism: Zen, Japanese Buddhism, Vietnamese Buddhism, Thai Buddhism, Sri Lankan Buddhism. And the world is drinking it up and loving it. And there may come a time when our planet has a large enough Buddhist population base that we'll start to see political parties. The Buddhist Socialist Party is an example, or the Buddhist Democratic Party, or the Buddhist Republican Party. And we may see a concerted effort for Buddhism to take over the world, in which case the Tibetans would get their justice and their judgment and be the reigning ones over the planet. Certainly the world does not want to be ruled by the racist Chinese communist doctrines of Mao Zedong and the cruelties he inspired during the Communist Revolution. And I'm not saying that everything is bad coming out of China. That's simply not the case. The Chinese people are very productive. Their country has a lot of good things about it. I really like the fact that they don't allow public buildings of religion, because it can be overstated and overpowering and literally take over the national identity of the people. And I really like the fact that they do support workers' rights in some instances, not every instance. They're technologically advanced. There's a lot of things the Chinese have done that is, you know, okay. And there's a lot of bad things they've done. Flooding Ming villages, diverting rivers, building cities that are uninhabitable, you know, waste, militarism, building of islands on ecologically sensitive coral formations to defend a mainland. You know, there's a lot of problems with China and Chinese communism. And so I think what we have here is a problem of the dominated and the dominator. It's almost like master-slave. And the dominator wants to take over the world. And there's a higher spiritual calibration going on about justice and judgment. And it may not be for the Chinese. It may not be their karma. It may not be just or the judgment, the will of the stars and the moon, that they should rule the world. They may have the money to, they have the military to do it, they may have the desire to do it, but you know what? They may not have the karma to do it. And if that's the case, look, justice and judgment are going to reign supreme. These are higher cards than the magician and the world. Now, the world is a very high card, but in this context, it's a Chinese world. This is not an open and free world. It's a world watched over by someone in a Mao outfit. It's a communist world. And that's a doubtful aspiration, to be honest. You know, Russia is no longer communist. Communism has failed in every country on earth and is only really practiced in Nepal, Vietnam, North Korea, and China. I mean, you know, it has residue in Russia and in small countries south of Russia that hold on to the old guard, and or regions, not actual countries, and maybe in Cuba. But communism is over. It's dead, and it's only China that still seems to be practicing it. And, you know, when we're dealing with higher things, more truthful things, things that are on a level that transcends culture and transcends national identity, we're dealing with things like karma, justice, and judgment. And in the Buddha's first sermon, which is written right here, the Buddha said, look, this is life. It's filled with suffering. The suffering will come to an end, and people will have to lead noble lives to end their suffering. But this is a place of great suffering. And, you know, that's something not new to the Tibetan people, but communism seems to think that it can conquer its way and buy its way into anything it wants. And what I'm seeing here in the cards is that there are higher forces at hand that transcend the communist dogma and the desire for world and Tibetan domination.